Welcome, Angelique, and thanks for joining us today. Angelique Abernathy was raised in Eastern North Carolina, and after graduating from the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics, she studied at Tufts, where she graduated with a BA in Africana Studies. Previously, she worked as a high school history teacher. Angelique, thank you for joining us. What are you sharing with us today?
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be with you. I am honored to be sharing about the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. And we will be talking about civil rights and actually largely human rights through words. Next slide. So I just went through this. We will be talking about the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Murray and using their experiences and their work to highlight some aspects of civil rights history. Next. So, to ground us and to give you a little bit of background about who I am and the work that I do. Oop, I think I just hit the mic, so I'm going to try not to do that. So I am the Director of Education and Outreach for the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, and that is the image on the right. So as you can see, the Pauli Murray Center is a home. So we are situated in the Fitzgerald family home. We are honored to be the current shepherds of that home and really making sure that that is a space that continues to be used for community work, to talk about Durham history, to talk about North Carolina history, and to talk about the Reverend Dr. Murray themselves. So on the left, you will see a timeline, a family history tree of Pauli Murray's family, right? So at the very bottom, you have Pauli Murray themselves. And then you see their parents are Agnes Fitzgerald Murray and William Murray. So Pauli Murray is actually the fourth of 6 children born to them and ends up coming to Durham to live with their aunt and their namesake, Aunt Pauline Fitzgerald, after their mother tragically passes away. The other 5 children stay with their father, and unfortunately, he ends up being killed while seeking treatment for mental health. And all of the children end up being orphaned. But Pauli Murray stays with Aunt Pauline, another aunt, and their grandparents in this home, which is, again, the site of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. You know the next slide. So as you can probably tell, when I'm referring to Pauli Murray, I use she pronouns. I also use they pronouns. If you go to our website and you do some digging, you will see that we talk about pronouns explicitly and why we use a variety of pronouns in speaking about Reverend Dr. Murray. And that is because we know through letters, through things that they have written throughout their life, through experiences that we have access through the Radcliffe Institute, through the Schlesinger Library, that this is a person who was having a lot of internal and external conversations about their identity and who they were in the world, even from a young age. Pauli Murray, in their family biography, Proud Shoes, talks about lovingly being called a boy girl by their Aunt Pauline, right? And being allowed to wear pants in a time that was not necessarily the norm for girls, and being allowed to do typical boy things. And we honor that part of who Pauli was by using a variety of pronouns when we refer to them, okay? So you will hear me refer to them in different ways. And the quote that is in the middle, as I'm speaking, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, the quote that is in the middle speaks to some of that tension that Pauli Murray felt throughout their life. and the realities that we can have a lot of professional success, and we can have a lot of outward success in the world. And that does not mean that we might not sometimes still be grappling or dealing with things personally and internally. The two images on the top of the screen there are actually from an album that Pauli Murray made themselves called The Life and Times of an American Called Pauli Murray, right? And you see these different ways that in 1931, when Pauli Murray did this, they would refer to themselves. The dude is one of the ways that they refer to themselves. And you see the imagery that they use, right? So we can also think about how people use their clothes also to show who they are and how they feel, and how that can even change on a day-to-day basis. On the bottom, we have another important person in Pauli Murray's life, which is Irene. And Irene was Pauli Murray's long-term life partner. And this is someone who Pauli Murray held closely and who they esteemed as being extremely important as they did the work that they did in the community, to keeping them grounded and to being an important ear for them. Next slide. So I want us to take a moment, because there's a lot to talk about when we talk about Pauli Murray and the Fitzgerald family and all of the things that happened even in the civil rights time period. And often when we talk about civil rights, we think about a very specific time period, and we think about very specific people. And often those people had more public roles in a movement. So those people will often be the disruptors, right? They're shaking things up. They're the people you hear about. They get put on the news. They are sometimes also going to be your storytellers. Those are your charismatic people that can weave together the things that are going on and make people feel invested in the story. But we don't often hear about all of the other people who are involved in social change. And this is just a reminder that we all have a role, right? And that role can also change throughout your life, throughout experiences, throughout careers, etc. So in addition to the disruptors and the storytellers, we also have the healers, right? The people who you go to, whether it's professionally or personally, to just help you kind of relax or to help you process. The people who think about, what does it look like in the future when we have these miraculous things and we can all be who we are? The visionaries, right? You have the people who are trying things and they're okay with failure. Those are our experimenters. So I want you all to also think about the fact that it's okay to not be the person who is up on the stage, or the person who is really good at remembering all of the facts and figures, that there is still a role for you and there is still somewhere that you can fit in, and that has equal importance. Next slide. So when we talk about the storytellers, Pauli Murray at their core was a storyteller. So the Reverend Dr. Murray was a lawyer. They were an Episcopal priest. They were a frontline worker and responder. They were a waitress. They held many different titles, but they considered themselves at their core a poet turned lawyer rather than a lawyer turned poet, right? So storytelling and weaving and sharing informations about people and cultures was central to who Pauli Murray was. And they did this throughout their life, from being a young child hearing the stories that grandfather would tell on the porch and reading the newspaper to grandfather because he could not read himself because he was blind, to deciding to write Proud Shoes, which is this wonderful book that gives you all of this beautiful history about Pauli Murray themselves, the Fitzgeralds as a family, Durham as a community, and the West End neighborhood that Pauli Murray grew up in. Next slide. Pauli Murray was also a disruptor, as I'm sure you can tell by some of the things that I've shared, right? This is someone who was born in 1910 and lived until 1985. And they were a girl who was running around wearing pants as a kid, right? That is not something you necessarily think of girls in like 1910, 1915, right? So again, from their youth, Pauli Murray was a disruptor. They were willing to do what we call speak truth to power. They were willing to say, hey, this doesn't look or feel right, and I am willing to speak up about that. So we have a lot of examples of Pauli Murray doing this. When we talk about writing as a form of civil rights or human rights work, Pauli Murray wrote a lot of letters to a lot of different people. One of the books that people love to read about Pauli Murray is The Firebrand and the First Lady. And this is all about the relationship between Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt. And the way that this relationship started is because Pauli Murray, after Eleanor Roosevelt's husband, the President Roosevelt, went to Chapel Hill and gave a speech talking about how it was a wonderful liberal institution after Pauli Murray was just denied entry to that same place for being Black. So Pauli Murray writes this letter to the president and sends a copy to the First Lady and says, I do not appreciate this, and I need to speak up about the reality of this institution and how we need to grapple with what it means that you are calling it this wonderful place, but a large population can't go there. And out of that, Pauli Murray develops a long-lasting friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, if you know anything about like human rights, Eleanor Roosevelt goes on to do a lot of work in creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you can also think about Pauli Murray as someone who impacts the work of other impactful people. Next slide. And then frontline responders. I don't tend to talk about Pauli Murray as much in this way. I focus more on Pauli Murray's grandparents. So Robert Fitzgerald, who I mentioned earlier, was Pauli's grandfather, who comes south. He is an educator, and he believes that education, after fighting in the war, he is a veteran, and he comes down to the South, believing that education is the next frontier for African Americans. And he believes that he can help to bring more educational opportunities to Black people in the South. He comes and helps to continue building the West End neighborhood, which is a historic African American community in Durham, North Carolina. He and his wife build their family home, which is that home that I showed you in the beginning, brick by brick. And they're also very invested in the community at large. Next slide. We can also think about weavers, right? I mentioned how Pauli Murray is someone who impacts a lot of other people who do work. And in addition to Eleanor Roosevelt, you also have Pauli Murray's influence on NOW, which is the National Organization of Women. You also have Pauli Murray's influence on the Brown versus Board of Education case. So when we think of, actually, I will get to that in a minute. I will stick to this. Pauli Murray is someone who thought about all of the different identities that they held as being intersecting identities. And that word may be familiar to some of you, intersecting or intersectionality, or intersectionality. Pauli Murray created a term that came even before intersectionality. And this idea was Jane Crow. When Pauli Murray went to law school, because again, the Reverend Dr. Murray did many things in their life. When Pauli Murray went to law school at Howard University, they realized they were the only woman in their law school class. And they realized that they were having a lot of experiences that their male counterparts, who were still also Black, were not having. So Pauli Murray started to do thinking and developed Jane Crow as a way to understand the particular experiences of Black women, right? And this is the precursor, and I'm speaking now more to the educators in the room. This is the precursor to Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality that is coined in 1989, right? There are differences, but and you also have Pauli Murray making connections between the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, and many other things that are going on at this time. Part of that work is shown in their letter to the chairman of the National Board of NOW, and trying to help other people who are doing this work understand that I cannot separate the fact that I am both a woman and I am Black, right? And those intersecting realities color how I see the world and also how the world sees me and my experiences in it. In addition to that, Pauli Murray also had an extensive address book. And an address book might not be something familiar to everyone listening in right now. So in the time before technology, people would actually write out all of the names and addresses and contact information of all the people in their life. So they would have it in one notebook that they could refer to. And in Pauli Murray's address book, there are 609 contacts. And that is people from Eleanor Roosevelt to people like Harry Belafonte, right? So you have a vast network of people who are doing the work of civil rights, who are doing the work of art, and who are in community with each other. Next slide. As I said before, oh, that's a little cut off. As I said before, Pauli Murray was a visionary, right? And I started to mention Brown versus Board of Education a little bit, and I stopped. So I will go into that here now. So the Brown versus Board of Education case is the case that gives us desegregation, right? This is a case that many people know about, but what we don't often talk about is that 20 years before, people were not thinking about dismantling or taking apart school segregation in the way that they did for that case. So when Pauli Murray was in law school, Pauli Murray actually came up with an idea to overturn the Brown versus Board statute in a way that other people were like, I don't think that that would catch on. I don't think that people would like that. And the second quote, the first two quotes here. One day during class discussion, these are from Pauli Murray themselves, in a flash of poetic insight, I advanced a radical approach that few legal scholars considered viable in 1944. In essence, I was challenging the traditional NAACP tactic of concentrating on the equal side of the Plessy equation. So in Plessy versus Ferguson, a lot of the NAACP people who are trying to get it overturned or changed focused on the separate but equal, the equal side of separate but equal being wrong, right? But it was a really hard fight that they were trying to win. So Pauli Murray said, while in law school, still learning, still a student, what if we focus on the separate part? What if we try to say that by being separate, it's inherently unequal? And people were like, oh, no, no, no. Because at that time, little known fact, people were not actually necessarily seeking integration, right? They just wanted equal opportunities, equal access, and equal resources. So, as Pauli says here, my approach was considered too visionary, one likely to precipitate an unfavorable decision of the Supreme Court. None of us dreamed that the Supreme Court would deliver a death blow to the Plessy doctrine in Brown v. Board, not 25, but only 10 years later. Pauli Murray, when they were in law school, made a bet with their professors and the other law students that Plessy versus Ferguson will be overturned, and it will be with this argument that I am saying right now. And it was literally with the argument that Pauli Murray made in law school that was used by those who argued Brown v. Board to have segregation overturned, right? So Pauli Murray thought about this way before people were willing to even consider it an option. So for my visionaries, my folks who are willing to dream and imagine beyond where we are now, my folks who people tell you, oh, I don't know if that could happen. I don't know. I can't imagine that. Keep dreaming. You never know what may happen. Next slide. Pauli Murray was also an experimenter. As I stated before, Pauli Murray was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women and envisioned it as an NAACP for women. They wanted it to be a space that pulled together the ideas of separate movements that were happening at the time. And in this, right, Pauli Murray helped to make this organization and then actually ends up leaving it because of differences in vision and differences in ideas. So through this process, right, as an experimenter, it doesn't mean that what you create is always going to be something that you will be in charge of forever, or that it will even be a great idea long term, right? But these experiences add to your knowledge. They add to your connections, and they add to your impact. Next slide. You can skip this one. And then we have our caregivers. I do not talk about Pauli Murray for this slide. I more so speak to their aunts. So the aunts who took care of Pauli were caregivers. They were educators, right? They took in their niece at a time where Pauli had no other place to go, and loved Pauli Murray for all of who they were. And caregivers are important because they nurture and nourish the people around them, right? We cannot do hard work and be in community with each other without the caregivers that help to create community, that create connection, that bring joy. So thank you to all of our caregivers. And next slide. And then we have our guides. Pauli Murray was also a professor. And I often think about educators, teachers, and professors as guides, selfishly maybe because I am one. But the role of a guide is to teach, counsel, and advise, to use your gifts of well-earned discernment and wisdom, which is so interesting. And I love this quote from Reverend Dr. Murray, because They say, I don't know if I would think of myself as a role model for anyone else. I'm busy trying to get that person to be what that person wants to be. And I'm always tinkering with well, what do you want to be? I say, and then begin to encourage that, because all of us are unique. And if we could just get people to realize their own uniqueness, that I am like nobody else on this planet. I am special. I am unique. I am one little fragment. I'm like everyone else, but I am. And if I'm not there, it's a different situation. Tiny as my little contribution is, it makes a difference. So Pauli Murray would not consider themselves a role model based on this quote, but I think that this is exactly what a role model would say. So the Reverend Dr. Murray taught at the University of Ghana. They also were a professor at Brandeis, and they were one of very few women law professors at Yale as well. They were an important mentor to female students like Eleanor Holmes Norton and Marian Wright Edelman. So although Pauli Murray would not necessarily say that they were a role model, they served as an inspiration and mentor for generations of activists, scholars, lawyers, and priests. Next slide. And then we have our healers. So in the end of their life, Pauli Murray, after the death of their partner Irene, who I mentioned earlier, Pauli Murray turned to the church. And Pauli Murray decided that the work of changing the country and changing things for the better needed to actually start with the hearts of people. So there's a quote here that says, "In my earliest youth, I sought to work out intolerable frustrations through poetry. As I became more deeply involved in the civil rights movement in the 1940s, I turned to the law as a means of working within the system for social change. In time, as the world crisis has deepened, I began to realize that the law by itself is inadequate to cope with the fundamental moral and ethical issues of our time. And this led me to theology." So Pauli Murray talks about always seeking to have an integrated mind, body, and spirit, and understanding that if you can change people's hearts or get to them through their hearts and connect to them on a spirit or soul level, that it would be easier to make these societal changes that we talk about. So when I say Reverend Dr. Murray, this is someone who was an Episcopal priest. This is the first Black woman to be ordained as an Episcopal priest. And they are ordained in the very same church that their grandmother, as an enslaved person, had to sit up at the top balcony to watch church services from. So I think that is an important piece of their story to share as well. Next slide. So again, remember, we all have a piece and a role to play within work for social change. And your role can change throughout your life. As we see through the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Murray, you can be a guide at one point and a healer at another. You can begin as an experimenter and become a caregiver, right? And you can also inhabit multiple of these spaces at once as well. Next slide. So I just want you to think about, I've shared so much. What does Pauli's story offer to the next generation? Or what does it offer to you, right? So I will share some things that I always take away from these presentations. One, trust your feelings and experience. Pauli Murray has always been very sure in who they are, right? Even when the world around them has different ideas of who they should be, and stood in that. And that very trust in self is what made them who they were. 2, your ideas have value, even if they are different from what others think. And especially if they are, actually, I would say. We need the people who are visionaries. We need the people who think differently because we grow in community. 3, you can make a difference with your ideas, your writing, and your action, right? Your way of making a difference doesn't have to look like someone else's. And it also doesn't have to be in the same sphere of the world as other people. We talked about Pauli Murray and civil rights, but Pauli Murray also loved dogs, right? And I am personally a huge animal lover. So if that's your passion, you can make difference and make change in that way. And 4, there are so many ways to change the world and follow your calling. Again, next slide. So here at the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, we are working to build a better world that engages diverse communities to uplift the life and legacy of activist, legal scholar, feminist, poet, Episcopal priest, and LGBTQ community member, Reverend Dr. Murray, in order to tackle enduring inequities and injustice in our nation. Next. So at the Pauli Murray Center, there are a few really interesting things to know about us. So we were designated a National Historic Landmark in 2016, and it is very important to note that less than 2% of landmarks are dedicated to Black people, and even less than that are dedicated to telling queer or LGBTQ histories and stories. So this site, the Pauli Murray Center, is dedicated to both. We also celebrated the center's 10-year anniversary in 2022. So we are a long-standing community institution that was created out of community voice and community asks and community demands. And we are proud to be continuing the work of building belonging for over 10 years. We are in this year going to be open as a visitor-ready site. And then moving forward, we will be designing a new education and welcome center at the Pauli Murray Center. And we have some signature programming. If you have been interested in the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Murray before, if this is your first time hearing and you want to know more, you can visit us on the grounds of the Pauli Murray Center for a site visit. We also do engagement opportunities like what I am doing right now. You can request a speaker. You can also engage in a whistle stop tour, West End Journey, which tells the story of the Reverend Dr. Murray and also the story of the West End neighborhood more broadly, and all of the wonderful things that this historically African-American community has been able to do and accomplish and be over the years. We also annually celebrate Reverend Pauli Murray Feast Day, which is a celebration at St. Titus Episcopal, and have an annual birthday celebration for the Reverend Dr. Murray in November. So these are just some of the signature programming that we do at the center. And lastly, I just want to share some education resources very quickly. So we have a resource that allows you to learn about Durham's history of activism more largely, and that is a Firebrand's Guide to Durham's History of Activism. There are modules there that let you learn about different movements, people, and institutions in Durham, the history of them, some that still exist today, many actually do, as well as resources for curriculum and primary source materials. We also have primary and secondary curricular materials that are specifically about the Reverend Dr. Murray themselves and engaging students with their life and legacy. And then lastly, every year we welcome summer firebrand interns, which are college interns who do work with the center. And last year, our interns created a gender expansive zine to allow people different access points into the conversation of gender and what it means to live in a gender expansive world. So, yeah. Any questions? I now have time to answer a few. And again, reminder, I am Anjalique Abernathy, the Director of Education and Outreach at the Pauli Murray Center, and my contact information is there.
Thank you, Angelique. Wow, that was amazing. I really like how you wove together all of this multiplicity of the aspects of Pauli Murray in this presentation. Thank you. So we have some questions, and people are interested if Pauli Murray knew or interacted with Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who also knew Dr. Eleanor Roosevelt really well.
That is actually something that I don't have a lot of information on, but I have gotten that question before, and I really want to say the answer is probably yes. If someone wants to do that research, there is a possible collaboration with the center right there.
There you go. All right. And we've had a request to share your contact info. If you're okay, I'm going to put that back up on the screen.
Absolutely.
Real quick. And there we go. There's that. So another question is, yeah, Charlotte Hawkins Brown was doing so much work on some of the same topics at the same time in the same state. And it's hard to imagine that they were not crossing paths.
Indeed.
And somebody was commenting, surely Charlotte Hawkins Brown is in that address book. Something we can look up later. So here's a question. Is the civil rights movement over that Dr. Pauli Murray worked on?
Ooh.
What is the center's position on this, and how do you respond?
I would have to say that I don't know if the center has an official position on this, but we are still fighting for many of the same rights and freedoms that the Reverend Dr. Murray was working toward in their life. I take solace in the fact that one of the quotes that we often use at the center is from Reverend Dr. Murray is, "I have lived long enough to often see my lost causes found," right? And to understand that we are a part of a legacy and we are on a continued journey. So no, I do not believe that the civil rights movement is over. I also believe it started before people often say that it did as well.
Terrific. Would you recommend Proud Shoes for middle school readers?
I would absolutely recommend Proud Shoes for middle school readers. I would also recommend a few other books.
Just happen to have.
So we have Pauli Murray's Revolutionary Life. This is actually a young adult biography written by Simke Kuznick. We also have Pauli Murray, The Life of a Pioneering Feminist and Civil Rights Activist. That was written by one of Pauli Murray's nieces and a current board member of the Pauli Murray Center. So in addition to Proud Shoes, there are also other resources, Firebrand and the First Lady, and also Song in a Weary Throat. There are a lot of resources. I would recommend Proud Shoes, particularly to delve into the importance of local history, of family history. If you want a thought partner on that, that is an area of personal interest. So, yeah.
Is the book club that we saw on the slide for adults or who?
It is for adults, mostly, but there are months where we gear it towards youth or young adults, different audiences, but it is usually geared towards adults. And we do a variety of different types of books, from YA novels to children's books, because I think adults should also read children's books, to, long and more heavy or serious reads.
Good to know. Good to know. Did Pauli Murray live at the house as an adult?
Oh, as an adult, yes, for a short time. But Pauli Murray actually lived a lot of their life in the Northeast.
Terrific. And when did the Pauli Murray Center form? Was the house just there? What's the history of the house? And that's probably going to have to be our last question.
Be the last question. So the Pauli Murray house came into a land trust because it was actually going to be demolished or bought out. And the community came together and said that this is an important piece of our history. This is an important piece of land, and we don't want to lose it. So out of that work, the Pauli Murray Project was created in collaboration with Duke University and other stakeholders to ensure that the Pauli Murray, or the Fitzgerald family home itself, would not be lost, and to ensure that that could be a space to continue to tell the story of Reverend Dr. Murray themselves, and also the family and of the West End neighborhood. So it's a community effort.
I think you've inspired many people to come visit and to learn more. A lot of lovely, lovely comments in the chat.